Hello, everyone. The meeting is currently in session.
Number 5 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Official Languages. La réunion d'aujourd'hui.
Today's meeting will be held in a hybrid format as per the House Order adopted on Thursday, November 25th, 2021, and members will be present in person or using the Zoom application. The proceedings will be posted on the House of Commons website. For your information, the webcast will always show the person who's speaking rather than the whole view of the committee.
And in light of the recommendations from health authorities, as well as the directive of the Board of Internal Economy on Friday, January 28th, 2022, to remain healthy and safe, all those attending the meeting in person, firstly, are to maintain 2 meters physical distancing. Secondly, must wear a non-medical mask when circulating in the room. And it is highly recommended that the mask be worn at all times, including when seated. And thirdly, must maintain proper hand hygiene by using the provided hand sanitizer in the room. En tant que président,
As chair, I will be enforcing these measures for the duration of the meeting, and I thank members in advance for their cooperation. For those of you who are participating virtually, I have a few rules that I'd like you to follow. You can speak in the official language of your choice. Interpretation services are available. At the bottom of your screen, you can select the floor, which does not have interpretation, English or French. If interpretation services are interrupted, please let me know as soon as possible, and we will make sure that we can reestablish service before resuming our work. For people who are participating in person, proceed as you normally would. Before speaking, wait till I recognize you by name. If you are participating online, I encourage you to click on the microphone icon to turn your microphone on. For those of you who are in the room, your microphones will be controlled by our agents in the room. I'd like to remind you that all comments of the members should be addressed to the chair. When you speak, please speak slowly, as I often do, and clearly. When you're not speaking, make sure your microphone is turned off. With regards to a speaking list, the clerk and I will do our best to maintain a consolidated order of speakers, whether people are participating online or in person.
Challenges arise. Please advise me. Please know that the way that we may need to suspend a few minutes as we need to ensure all members are able to participate fully. Donc,
so, pursuant to Standing Order 108.3F, and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, January 31st, 2022, the committee is holding an information session on urgent issues related to the application of the Official Languages Act. I would like now to welcome our witnesses. With us today by video conference from the Office of the Commissioner of Official Languages, we have Mr. Théberge, the Commissioner of Official Languages. Welcome back to our committee. Mrs. Isabelle Gervais, Assistant Commissioner, Compliance Assurance Branch. Mr. Pierre Leduc, Assistant Commissioner of Policy and Communications Branch. Mr. Éric Trépanier, Assistant Commissioner, Corporate Management Branch. And Mrs. Pascale Giguère, General Counsel, Legal Affairs Branch. So, to all these beautiful people, welcome. As you're used to this process, you have a maximum 5 minutes for your opening remarks, and from there we will move on to questions from our colleagues around the table, whether it be physical or virtual. Mr. Théberge, you have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Honorable members of the committee, hello. Although today's meeting is taking place virtually, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabe Cree, Oji Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, as well as the homeland of the Métis Nation. I'm here to talk to you today about urgent issues regarding the implementation of the Official Languages Act. With me today are my Assistant Commissioners Isabelle Gerbet, Pierre Leduc, and Éric Trépanier, and my General Counsel, Pascal Giguère. These are undoubtedly turbulent times in terms of language. The unprecedented attention official languages have generated across the country over the past year clearly shows how important official languages and linguistic duality are to Canada and Canadians. In 2021, the language question was a major issue in Canada as the result of a number of factors: Francophone immigration, education in the official language of the linguistic minority, official languages policy reform at both the federal and provincial levels, and numerous infringements to the Official Languages Acts.
With their official languages obligations is a significant and recurring issue for which we must find solutions. The numerous complaints I receive year after year are proof of this, and the trend is on the rise. We received well over 1,000 complaints again in 2020, 2021, and so far this year, we have already received more than 5,500, which is 5 times more than we normally receive in a year. Among the complaints we have received in recent months are a record number of complaints about Air Canada CEO Michael Rousseau's unilingual speech, and a large number of complaints about Mary Simon's appointment as Governor General of Canada. By filing complaints with my office, Canadians, and more specifically, French-speaking Canadians, have spoken out. They have sent a clear message to the government that we need to do more to ensure that our 2 official languages are respected. I think this speaks volumes about how Canadians feel about their language rights now, and their message must be heard. They've had enough. They are demanding that their language rights be respected, and they expect their leaders, especially the leaders of federal institutions subject to the Official Languages Act, to be fluent in English and French.
I have been saying this for too long. Despite hundreds of investigations, recommendations, and special reports aimed at addressing official languages issues, and despite all the efforts that have been made to ensure compliance with the Act, Canadians' language rights continue to be violated. I must admit that in its current form, the Official Languages Act does not allow me to effectively fulfill my mandate to protect official language rights. The most powerful tool I currently have is making recommendations. So I need new powers to ensure compliance more effectively, such as the power to enter into enforceable agreements coupled with administrative monetary penalties.
Institutions improve their compliance with the Act, and thus to better protect the language rights of Canadians. I hope that they will be part of the measures proposed in the new bill, which we're all very much looking forward to seeing. The measures presented by the government in its official language reform document are promising and seem to offer concrete solutions to many of the issues within the current Act. I hope to see in the new bill the same commitment to truly protect the language rights of Canadians, and I will be happy to share my perspective of the proposed bill with you in due course. Thank you for your attention, and I will be happy to answer your questions in the official language of your choice.
Merci, Monsieur Théberge.
Thank you, Mr. Théberge. That was 4 minutes and 10 seconds. Much appreciated. So we will start with the first round of questions from our first vice chair, Mr. Joël Godin. 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to welcome the Official Languages Commissioner as well as his entire team. My question is for Mr. Théberge. After listening to your presentation, what I understand is that in Canada, the will is not matched with powers to the Commissioner to ensure that our bilingual country be protected and promoted. We need to promote this. Can you tell us how you, as a Commissioner, you feel when you're inundated with complaints? These actions and reactions are coming from Canadians. So how do you feel as a commissioner, given the mandate that you have to protect both official languages? Thank you very much for the question. First of all, this is a very large mandate protecting Canadians' linguistics rights. What I've noticed after a few years is that despite the 60,000 complaints that we've received in the past and the innumerable recommendations we've made, the situation doesn't seem to be improving. We have to realize that maybe we don't have the right tools required to tackle this task, whether it be compliance or promotion. What's important is to take advantage of this reflection on the new Official Languages Act. We need to think about the tools that are made available to the Commissioner. These tools are necessary for the Commissioner, but they're also necessary to make sure that all Canadians have the possibility of speaking and living their language every day. I think it's important to continue with this reflection that has already started. If we don't change how we do things, we'll always be confronted to the same behaviors on the part of federal institutions. 60,000 complaints represents a ton of data. This data is telling us that the tools we have at our disposal are not sufficient for the task at hand. Mr. Commissioner, I think we agree on the statement of fact. We need to continue thinking about this question. We will be tabling the new Modern Official Languages Act that's based on the former bill C-32 that was, binned because of the election, and we have to start again from scratch. But what you're raising here and what you're demonstrating is that we have a major problem and that you don't necessarily have the right tools to tackle it. Are you among those who want to move things along quickly, or among those who want to take their time to make sure that the tool we have will stand the test of time and that it will protect, let's be honest, not English? We have to be realistic. French is the language that's suffering. So do you think we should be fast-tracking the modernization of the Official Languages Act, or do you suggest that we take our time to make sure we have a final result, an act that has the right tools and empowers the commissioner to protect the French language? Since 2018, there have been innumerable parliamentary reports and reflections that have been tabled. So many people have intervened. Associations, community organizations have all been heard. I think the government has all of the elements it needs in hand to be able to proceed quickly. Yes, there has been a decision in January that has shed some light on some parts of the law. That said, I think this decision has been clear enough. We can integrate parts of this judgment into the Act. Excuse me, Mr. Commissioner, we are limited in time, so I apologize for interrupting you. From part of your answer is you're saying, yes, we have to go fast because we have everything we need in hand. Are you saying that C-32 has everything in it that will allow you to be empowered to protect the French language? I think that C-32 could use a few additions. This could be done in parliamentary committee meetings. In C-32, we're not talking about financial penalties. So currently, C-32 is not fulsome enough, but I do believe we know what needs to be integrated in the next version of the bill. So what I'm understanding is that you think we have what we need to proceed quickly? Yes, thank you. 15 seconds. Mr. Commissioner, I think we need to take our time because we will be making a history-making act, and our opinions diverge on this. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Godin. Now 6 minutes for Mr. Francis Drouin. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Commissioner, for coming to our committee. I've not had the opportunity to meet you officially yet through my work in this committee, but I do represent a large Franco-Ontarian community. We represent 60%. We're losing a few members every 5 years, according to the census, though. I looked at your statement from January 28th with the decision from the Court of Appeal, and my colleague from the other side of the table has referred to it as well. What is your reaction and what are your recommendations? You evoked Bill C-32, but I would like to know what we can do as part of this work to protect French, and how can we reinforce things that are in C-32 and give more power to the Commissioner? First of all, we need to focus on the parts of the Act that speak directly to what you're talking about. Part 17 speaks to federal institutions' obligations. They must take into consideration official language communities in minority situations. There is an obligation to take into consideration these communities. We have to make sure that when we develop programs and policies, that they support the community development and certainly not hinder it. The government needs to be proactive, must take positive measures to make sure that official language minority communities can thrive. With regards to aspects that speak directly to French, let's say that in applying the Act, if we're looking for true equality, we wouldn't be applying the law in the same way independently of location. There are certain parts of Canada where communities are very fragile. For example, in the West, there are very small French communities, for example, in my province of Manitoba. So in applying the Act, if we want true equality, we have to have a differentiated approach. And the Supreme Court has described what real equality means. When we talk about compliance, in C-32, we were talking about being able to have binding agreements with federal institutions. We need to put in place conflict resolution mechanisms. We currently don't have such tools at our disposal. We could also have financial administrative consequences. We would have a more complete toolbox at our disposal to use various tools in accordance to various situations. Currently, the Commissioner can make recommendations, and we've been making recommendations for many years. When we talk about how to better protect French, we have to protect it within the federal apparatus. Let's talk about the language of work. It's very important that in workspaces, there's one language that dominates over the others, and that's English. So we have to make sure that federal employees, that public servants, have the conditions necessary in place to use their English as a first language, French as a first language, or French as a second language. We have to build a culture that would promote languages. We don't talk about this very much in the modernization. We need to have better language training. And in Part 5 of the Act, of the bill, where we tackle the issue of the language at work, we talk about the fact that public servants need to have opportunities to use their first language or their second language. And we have to make sure that we have the structures in place that are making French a second-order language, and this has been going on for years and years and years.
Monsieur Théberge, je m'en voudrais.
Thank you, Mr. Théberge. I'd like to share my time with my Acadian friend, Mr. Sanson. Thank you, Mr. Théberge. It's a pleasure to see you again. And I very much appreciate the work you've been doing at the appellate court with Judge Gascon. If I look at the two analyses of the two courts, the appellate court and the other, they talk about the necessary for a robust work. Now, this has to be part of every agreement, otherwise you'll have to go to court every single time. There are crucial points. So, for you, sir, what do you think we have to put into a modernization of the Act? Thank you, Mr. Sanson. Perhaps, Commissioner, you'll be able to answer that during an answer to another question. Well, 6 minutes. Our second Vice Chairman, Mr. Mario Beaulieu. You have the floor, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Commissioner, for your presentation. I'd like to hear you speak to analysis made, a rather exhaustive analysis made on linguistic issues worldwide, and it seems that all analysts feel that this has to be based on the principle of territoriality, that this is very effective, and that you need something like the Official Languages Act, but the Official Languages Act is not effective in protecting language minorities. After 52 years of the Act, you cannot but notice that the assimilation rate of Quebecers outside Quebec keeps increasing. So, do you not think that we should change the very principles undergirding the Act? Well, there are many factors that come into the implementation of a policy. We don't always get the results we want. It has been 52 years, but if I look at minority communities outside Quebec, we have an act that is meant to protect official language minority communities. I believe that the model we should choose for dealing with official languages, this has to be something based on our values as Canadians. We need an approach that would improve the Act and remedy some things that are lacking. I think in the Canadian context, it's French that has to be protected. There are other approaches that could be considered as well. Well, there's another principle. You have the Official Languages Act, which has decided that there is an equivalency between francophones outside Quebec and anglophones in Quebec. Now, in Quebec, the minority community has schools, healthcare, all these things. So there isn't really equality between the two. There was a time when French was forbidden, was prohibited in schools in English Canada. So the Official Languages Act seems to be continuing to strengthen English, the status of English in Quebec, but there is not enough financing for French in the rest of Canada. Well, if I look at the implementation of the Act over the past 52 years, with respect to the two communities you mentioned, things changed differently in the two communities. They both have challenges, and over 50 years, they didn't change in the same way. Now, if we look at socioeconomic factors having to do with the English minority community in Quebec, some of these factors are lesser than those experienced by the French language community outside Quebec. I can provide all kinds of statistics, Mr. Beaulieu, and it would be my pleasure to do so, but what's important is that the situation today is not the same as the one 50 years ago. But basically, for Quebec, in Quebec, French is declining and quicker, whereas English is increasing. We could talk about all this, but please, on this, I will have other questions later. There was a recent article which had to do with a situation where someone criticized your work and there was a question of why there wasn't a mechanism to deal with issues. Thank you for your question. Unfortunately, I cannot comment on individual specific cases. Well, okay, but generally speaking, would that kind of mechanism be a good thing? I'm going to ask our lawyer to talk about that. You have 5 seconds. It's not much time. Perhaps later, another question. Another question, 6 minutes. And the question goes to Ms. Nikki Ashton, our new Democrat colleague. Hello, Mr. Commissioner. Have you had meetings with the Official Languages Minister or her team to discuss a bill on the modernization of the Official Languages Act? And were you consulted? Yes. I asked to meet with Minister Petitpas-Taylor, and I had the opportunity to present certain things that I feel are important and are important to be added to the modernization. Now, but based on this, do you believe that the government understands the importance of giving the commissioner the power to set up an administrative tribunal? The minister was very open to the possibility of providing these tools to the commissioner. As I mentioned, there was a possibility of having binding agreements and monetary sanctions. But in some situations, it depends on the situation. There are other factors that have to be taken into account, so it seems to me, at least I had the impression, that the minister was really listening to what we had to say. Commissioner, you talked about the court's ruling on Part 7. and the federal court was asked to better define, or it did better define, the bill. And they said that some of the positive aspects had to be better defined. What do you think about the government saying, asking the government to table this bill in the next 100 days? Well, when a bill is tabled, then other options are delayed. In Part 7, the wording in Part 7 does not go against the Gascon ruling. So in a way, the timing of the federal court's ruling couldn't be better, because in the federal court, they are very specific about the principles necessary to give the legislation real teeth. And there were certain things in the ruling that would ensure this. Well, I'd like to change subject a bit and talk about immigration. Mr. Theberge, I just was looking to the chair to see how much time I had left. You're talking about immigration, Francophone immigration outside Quebec, about how many, or rather the democratic weight of a majority of Francophone immigrants in a minority situation. Now, beyond immigration targets, what kind of policy should we come up with in order to slow down the decline of French and ensure everyone's prosperity in these communities? Well, first of all, the 4.4%, that target, I don't think we'll be able to achieve it. We do have to meet a certain lock demographically. Now, what the government has to do is bring in a policy for Francophone immigrants outside Quebec, and in Part 7 of the Act, they should add a specific obligation to not only have a much more ambitious target, and in order to strike a balance, a better balance between both communities, because with time, this balance is being lost. We have to add to Part 7 specific obligations to create programs, immigration programs for Francophones in Francophone minority communities. Well, just to talk again about that, there is the issue of Francophone immigration. Should it be considered one of the government's main priorities aside from the Official Languages Act? Well, that's enough for this time. Perhaps, Mr. Commissioner, you'll be able to talk about this later. So now, for the second round, speakers will have 5 minutes. So, with 5 minutes, Mr. Jacques Gourde. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Theberge. I'd like to get back to one of my colleague, Ms. Ashton's questions, which made me almost jump out of my chair. Mr. Theberge, you said that you'd asked for a meeting with the Minister to discuss the modernization of the next Official Languages Act. Did it seem to you that if you hadn't asked for this meeting, you might have been forgotten? I don't think I would have been forgotten, but it's important to remember that with respect to Parliament, it is important that there be a certain distance between a commissioner and the government. My input, as I see it, is that which comes from my experience, or what we can contribute comes from our expertise. No, I think the minister would have invited us to talk about the next iteration of the Act. But we did send letters of congratulations to various ministers and made the invitation. Well, certainly, Mr. Theberge, your office has all the expertise necessary to make a great difference in the next iteration of the Act and its modernization. No, I congratulate you for having taken the initiative and to be part of this turning point in history, but still, I'm staggered by the fact that you might have been forgotten. That would have been very unfortunate. And another question. At the beginning of your presentation, you talked about incidents of a lack of respect. Does it seem to you that the Commissioner's office isn't necessarily respected by various institutions? I don't like to have to say it, it's sad to say it, but it seems that you're not listened to. And as an excuse, they say that you have to deal with complaints, not the rest of government. What do you have to say? Well, it seems to me that there have always been recommendations, and a great percentage of these recommendations are implemented. But even if they are implemented, that doesn't necessarily change the behaviors of federal institutions. What does this mean? It means that very often we manage official languages within federal institutions. So there may be a complaint and we deal with it. But I think it's now important to not see these same behaviors repeated. It's not acceptable. Thank you. That's all for me for now. Well, you have 1 minute and 20 seconds, sir, but that's fine. Would you like another question, or is that all right? Well, we'll take it. Yes, I'll stick to my time. Mr. Commissioner, you said this week that the federal government had come to agreements with all provinces but Ontario, and we do not see in these agreements a proportional spaces in kindergartens for Francophone minority communities. What can you do to make sure these children have access? Do you foresee the minister following your discussion? Do you foresee that she intends to put this into her new bill to modernize the Official Languages Act? You have less than 20 seconds. Well, it's hard to speculate on the bill, but I believe that agreements with respect to kindergartens reflect the importance of these dispositions in the Act. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
Okay, Angelo Iacono. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to say hi to all the guests. Thank you for being here. Mr. Commissioner, you said that the assessment of linguistic requirements for federal positions are inadequate. Can you enlighten us about what this assessment entail? According to Section 91 of the Official Languages Act, we have to objectively assess the linguistic requirements of a position. Is it English essential, French essential, or is it bilingual? And when we say bilingual, there are different levels. Another thing we noticed last year, in federal institutions, people do not seem to understand what Section 91 means. So what do we need to do? We need to identify the linguistic requirements so that we can offer services in both official languages. If we are not able to properly identify the linguistic requirements of positions, how can we expect to be able to serve Canadians in their language of choice? Could you be brief, please, because I have other questions for you, but you can keep going. So when we're talking about emergency situations, for instance, federal institutions play a critical role, but they don't have the necessary capacities to communicate in both official languages. Do you think an update is needed for both French and English for public servants so that they can adequately meet the needs of Canadians? Right now, if we don't properly identify the linguistic requirements, then we do a disservice to Canadians and their needs. Earlier, when I talked about the two languages, we have to make sure that the French language is used more inside federal institutions. Mr. Chair, how much time do I have left? 2 minutes and 10 seconds. Thank you. Mr. Commissioner, we already heard of the lack of bilingual candidates. What do you have to say to this? Well, we hear this observation quite often. The Treasury Board should make sure that people have access to the necessary tools to get the proper linguistic training. But not only getting training, but also maintaining their language skills. This means that we need a more inclusive workplace when it comes to linguistic inclusion. Minister Fortier was talking about grants to help public servants to improve their language skills. So some things are already in place. Great. You made a recommendation to the Government of Canada. You told us to implement internal procedures and tools inside federal institutions. Could you name a few examples that could help Canadians in both official languages? First, we developed a tool that is available to the Treasury Board. This tool is there to better identify the linguistic skills for positions. Many workshops are also offered to teach how to properly lead bilingual meetings to ensure that the French language has its place inside federal institutions. I'm good. Okay, so just 2-3 seconds left. Next, our second Vice President, Mario Beaulieu. All right. Well, first, I'd like you to... You have 2.5 minutes, Mr. Beaulieu. Well, Mr. Commissioner, you can finish the answer to my question. Someone criticized one of your decisions. He was saying, or asking rather, how come there's no independent organization to assess the state of official languages? Well, maybe the best thing to do is to give the floor to the General Counsel. She will explain what the current procedures are. Ms. Giguère. Thank you. Yes, I'd be happy to help you. First, when the commissioner or his office receives complaints, those complaints are analyzed, and we undertake action further to those complaints, and we follow usual practices. I don't want to know about the complaint process. When a complaint arrives at the office, what happens? There are some external investigators who can help. But before transferring complaints to external investigators, the commissioner reviews those complaints, and he uses his powers according to the law. Mr. Commissioner, another question for you. Do you agree to say that there's a decline of the French language in Quebec? I think the French language in Quebec has faced many challenges and will continue to do so, given the position of Quebec in North America. The French language is a minority language in Canada. This is why we need to protect it. So you're not ready to say that the French language is in decline? 2 seconds left. We will be able to go back to that if you want. Sorry, Mr. Beaulieu, but you still have another round. All right, another 2.5 minutes for a question from Nikki Ashton. Miss Ashton, the floor is yours. Thank you. I'd like to go back to the immigration topic. The question regarding consultation. Did you request a meeting with the Minister of Immigration and his team? Were you able to meet with him to talk about targets? We've had a meeting with the Minister of Immigration, and I will have to check with someone. In the congratulation letters, we asked for another meeting. I believe we did, Mr. Tiberge. As you know, I was lucky to meet my counterpart to talk about the situation. But the discussion with the Minister of Immigration is to follow up. Okay, so the answer is no. All right, so it's quite disappointing to hear this. We know that last week the same minister did a press conference 100% in English. So clearly there's a lack of, or rather the issue of Francophone immigration is not a priority. Quick question regarding targets. There are recommendations to increase the targets to 7%. There hasn't been any follow-up. What is your position in order to increase those targets? Yes, we need to increase immigration targets. The number could be 6, 7, or 8%. One thing for sure, we need to increase the target if we want to maintain the demographic weight between communities. Yes, there are agreements with provinces. Some provinces have a more important role to play when it comes to select immigrants. But when we're talking about Francophone immigration outside of Quebec, one of the main players is IRCC. Thank you, Mr. Taberge and Ms. Ashton.
Will ask my questions in English. So we have both official
Madame Gladou, est-ce que vous pouvez vous mettre en sourdine? Can you mute yourself, Mrs. Gladou?
Oh, yes.
Could you mute yourself, please? Next question from Mr. Dalton. Mr. Dalton, you have 5 minutes. The floor is yours. Well, if my colleague wants to take the phone, no, I'm kidding. Mr. Commissioner, thank you very much for your comments. I know that you and the Fédération francophone de la Colombie-Britannique were very successful in front of the Federal Court of Appeal regarding the agreement on employment. The Federal Court of Appeal said that the federal government didn't comply with its linguistic duties. Do you think the new Official Languages Act will be able to solve this issue? Okay, I'll go back to the answer I gave earlier. The current version of the bill will not go against the Gascon decision. Now, with the decision of the Federal Court of Appeal, it will go against the Gascon decision. But we have to make sure that Part 7 of the Act has many more impacts. Some of the principles were even identified by the Federal Court. Are there any negative impacts? I don't see any negative impacts. All I see is positive impacts. Now, there is the other part of the decision, which is about Part 4, and that's something completely different. They didn't overturn the decision of the lower court. But the Federal Court of Appeal clearly strengthened principles that are at the heart of Part 7 of the law. The decision strengthens the intention of lawmakers. And I believe that in the next version of the Act, we have to build on this decision. We might need to add a rule. This is something that we have to talk about in the next days or months. Thank you. According to you, do you think that the government could have been more proactive regarding this issue? Well, since the government was the other part in that trial, I must say it's a little bit ironic. The government does not want to defend the Official Languages Act. So if the government wants to withdraw, but I think that now it is part of the rule of law. A decision has been made. It is a clear one, a clear decision. And this clear decision is important to ensure that Part 7 of the Act will be able to support the development of our communities.
Linguistique pour
I missed the first part of your question. Would it be good to strengthen the linguistic obligations and duties for other positions, such as Governor General and Lieutenant Governor? And if so, which ones? Here's my position. Every leadership position within the federal government should, according to me, be able to use both official languages. May it be the director of the Museum of History or any other positions. They can lead by example. So that people, see that bilingual people are there. Examples can be there. It has to come from the top. Ms. Kayabaga, you have 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Rene. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner, for being here with us today. I have a question regarding your 2020-2021 report. It highlights the increase of the number of complaints from 2018 and the ensuing year, or rather the decrease in the ensuing years. What should we do in order to maintain the number of complaints to that level? The number of complaints depends on citizens. We don't really know why there was a decrease in 2018. It depends on what happens this year. For instance, there are more than 5,500 complaints that were submitted, which is 5 times more the standard number. 10 years ago, the average was 500, and now, 10 years after, the average doubled. This year, things have been exceptional, but it shows that Canadians react to some events, and they can react strongly when they feel that their language rights have been violated. So there can be some special contexts that do not lead to more complaints. So I don't know why we have fewer complaints in 2018, but I can tell you that this year, there are many. All right. I'd like to go back to a point raised by my colleagues. International students for Francophone immigration. We are currently conducting a survey on international students coming from Francophone countries. My second question is still about your report. You recommended MPs to work together to adopt laws that will benefit all Canadians. Which elements should be taken into consideration to go into that direction? When we create bill, and I will take the example of the Modernization of Official Languages Act. Some principles are very important, and we need to agree on those principles. The official languages is a fundamental value of Canada, and it's fundamental for the development of our country. It is important to also acknowledge that the official languages are part of an evolving landscape, and we need to modernize the Act to meet the needs of today, but also the needs of tomorrow. The society is changing, or rather, society is changing very fast. Technology is changing very fast. Immigration has a huge impact on our country. So official languages are part of a Canadian political project, same with multiculturalism and reconciliation. It's important to see our work as a contributing factor to nation building. I say that's what you see. Do you say rather in English? That's how I see a bill. A bill can help strengthen our values.
Thank you for your answer. It raises many points that the government has started working on. And like I said, there's international student immigration as well. My next question, if I still have time left, in the statement following the appellate course, the Federation of BC Francophones, you said that reparations will have a positive and concrete impact on all minority language groups. How do you think we can reach this? That's an excellent question, Mrs. Kayabaga, but there's no time left to respond to it. So we've just completed the second round. We're now moving on to the third round. Here, there will be 5-minute and 2.5-minute questions. I will let you know how much time you have.
Thank you, Chair. I apologize for being too eager to ask my questions. Welcome to all the witnesses today. So in the private sector, when you want to drive a certain behavior, you put the regulation in place. So we have the Official Languages Act. Then you make sure everyone is aware of it, promotion. So I think people are aware of the law and what we're trying to achieve. And then you put in a consequence if they don't comply to the law. So I guess my first question is, what is the consequence if somebody does not comply with the act for an individual or for an organization?
Well, we only deal with organizations. We only deal with federal institutions. And as I said many times during this appearance today, currently I can make recommendations, which is what I do. I make recommendations. I can do reports. I can do special studies. But at the end of the day, if a federal institution does not implement a recommendation, there really is no real consequence. As I mentioned earlier, there's a significant number of recommendations which are implemented by federal institutions. The issue is that very often, though, it doesn't change the behavior of that institution, because we will get the same number of same kind of complaint from someplace else, whether it's language of work complaints or whether it's dealing with the public. And also, I think it's important to keep in mind that, to reference the business metaphor analogy, the business model of government has changed a lot since the inception of the Official Languages Act. For example, prior to 1992, Transport Canada operated.
I'm sorry, I only have a limited amount of time.
Okay.
So let me
Okay.
ask you, what do you think the consequence should be for an institution that doesn't comply to the act?
I think number one, we have to be able to have different tools. One would be to have be able to negotiate binding agreements with federal institutions. Secondly, would be able to give orders in terms of you haven't done what you're supposed to, so this is what will happen. And another possibility, and this is more in line with maybe those businesses governed by federal charter. We could talk about monetary administrative penalties as a possibility, but the reality is right now you make recommendations, and we've received over 60,000 complaints, and probably more recommendations over the years. So
right, it sounds like with 60,000 complaints, there needs to be some consequences, or this will continue. Now, you mentioned needing a conflict resolution mechanism. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, currently, when someone files a complaint, there are two approaches, which is a formal investigation process, and there's more of an informal, facilitated approach. But there are a number of ways that we could work with an institution. There are other mechanisms. There's alternate dispute mechanisms, and in the proposed legislation, it gives us that opportunity to put in place those mechanisms. So how can we work better with institutions to ensure better compliance, other than complaint recommendation? There must be other ways that we can work with these institutions to have better outcomes.
Yes, and how frequently, when you see gaps, you mentioned that, for example, we're missing linguistic skills with some of the candidates. When you see the gaps, how often do you update the minister so that she can take action?
Well, we don't deal with the minister. We do deal with Treasury Board. We do, for example, send to Treasury Board all our reports dealing with Section 91 complaints, which have to do with identifying the linguistic requirements of positions, of all those cases where it was not done correctly, to inform Treasury Board that there's a problem, it's systemic. And when we have a systemic issue, you will not resolve it by a complaints process. You will resolve it by a systemic approach to resolve the issue, which is often.
But if the Treasury Board is seized with all kinds of other financial issues, and they don't tell the minister, then the minister doesn't know what the gaps are that need to be addressed. Anyway, I think I'm out of time, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Mrs. Gladue. You still had 5 seconds, though. Notre proche.
Our next person who will ask question has 5 minutes. It will be our parliamentary secretary to official languages. Marc Seri, you have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Theberge, and to your whole team. Your team is extremely efficient. So my colleague asked you a question earlier. I just want you to know that I was just named as parliamentary secretary on December 13th, and I had already received a letter of congratulations and a request to meet by December 6th, that is, so in a single working day. So you're very efficient. Also, the Minister of Immigration is very committed to French immigration and to official languages, and I just wanted to make that very clear. So, Mr. Theberge, I wanted to ask you something. What is your assessment of the implementation of the official languages action plan from 2018 to 2023 up to date? And then what are your expectations for the renewal of this initiative? There are 3 axes of work. The second one is to watch the implementation of the action plan on official languages. And what we've noticed following several meetings with many stakeholders in the field is that the action plan and its implementation worked really well. Let's remember that this is a pandemic. Departments have had to adapt in order to contribute, for example. But we'll also be publishing a report soon on the implementation of the action plan. We will emit a series of recommendations. These recommendations will be targeted at the next action plan. So what we're seeing in the current action plan is generally good. So we'll be looking at next steps, how to take into consideration the feedback that we've had from stakeholders. We'd also like to participate in the consultation process that would be kicking off in March 2023 about the next action plan. I'm so sorry, I don't have much time, and I'm going to be sharing my time with my colleague Patricia. If possible, following the meeting, can you send your conclusions following your meeting with the president of the Treasury Board on official languages? I know that you met with Minister Fortier. So, Patricia, I think you have 2 minutes and 10 seconds left. Okay, I'll hurry.
For being amongst us today. I'm going to cut to the chase and ask you the question with regards to the overseeing of your the implementation of the recommendations. So I'm to understand that you want a little bit more of a bite into this new law, which is a serious consideration. And I was just wondering, you know, you mentioned before if there should be default to maybe impose monetary repercussions. And when we're dealing sometimes with companies, a fine is not exactly an incentive to not do or to do, right? So is that the only, incentive or, pecuniary or punitive measure that you're seeking, or is there other options that we can explore?
I think when we tabled our position paper in 2019, we did mention other options. One was binding agreements, des ententes exécutoires, with institutions, and this can work just as well with federally relegated companies. You can have the possibility, and then the possibility to donner des ordonnances.
To emit orders.
The question of monetary administrative penalties is on the table. It's interesting, but I think it really would apply more to the corporate side than to federal institutions, because it's federal institutions. It's taking money from Peter to pay Paul,
right?
Kind of
exactly.
Thing. But it could be in terms of a graduated set of measures. You can start with binding agreements and you proceed, and it depends which one works with which institution or which organization.
And what about? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. And what about the publication of either these sentences or judgments or binding agreements? What do you think about the publication of these agreements? Do you think?
Ce sera tout, Madame Latanzio. Vous pourrez revenir parce que...
That's everything, Mrs. Latanzio. You'll have a turn for 5 minutes later, so hold on to your question. Now moving on to Mr. Mario Beaulieu. You have the floor. Earlier, Mr. Theberge, if I understood correctly, you said that English Quebecers make less money than Francophone Quebecers. Can you tell us where you got this information? Well, my sources are from Statistics Canada. If we look at household income, even education levels, if you would like, I can send you additional information about this. Earlier, I mentioned that communities have evolved over 15 years. The Anglophone community in Quebec has also evolved in the last 50 years. It's important to take that into consideration. They face particular challenges, just like French communities outside of Quebec have their own issues as well. I think it's important to mention. I will provide you supplementary documents. That would be a pleasure, because I think the average income of Anglophones is still much higher than Francophones. There have been many studies on this, so it's far from being cut and dry, but I'd be interested in hearing more. So let's talk about protecting French in Quebec. What does that look like in terms of positive measures in Part 7 of the Official Languages Act? Well, Quebec has many levers at its disposal to protect French. These mechanisms are of provincial jurisdiction and not federal. So for you, the federal government can't do anything more? I think that federally agreements can be reached, whether it be with education, early childhood education, immigration, etc. We need to make sure that Quebec has the tools at its disposal that can help them protect French. This is a particular situation. Chapter 7 is there to support communities, official language communities in a minority situation. It's not there to support the majority. However, in the bill, we are committed to protecting and promoting French in Quebec and beyond. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. The next question up for questioning is Nikki Ashton for 2.5 minutes. Thank you. Mr. Commissioner, I would like to come back to the immigration question and the connection to recruiting. We know that we have trouble recruiting professionals, early childhood educators, up to the university level. There are many Francophone African communities. They're a large pool for recruitment and a potential pool for recruitment. in the future, should we put in place targeted positive measures to increase our recruitment potential in African countries? It is obvious that the current situation represents a systemic issue at IRCC. When we look at recruiting international people, there's a problem when we refuse requests that are coming from specific countries, especially in Africa. As a former dean, I can tell you we were often recruiting in these countries and we had to wait a very long time to get study permits. When we talk about candidate selection, if we are serious about looking for Francophone candidates, we have to look in French-speaking countries. Exactly. So according to you and based on your previous work, do you think we should have a general target and also a regional or Francophone countries target in order to achieve tangible results for our communities? As I said earlier, it's important to recruit in places where there are Francophones. We could widen our traditional pool to do this. Often, international students, and I will end on this, ask for permanent residency. They contribute to increasing numbers in workplaces. So there is a problem that has been identified, and now we need to find solutions. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Thank you, Mrs. Ashton. Our next member has the floor is Mr. Godin. You have 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Théberge. I would like to come back on a question I asked earlier. You know, in committees, we're always running out of time, but you said that the federal government had closed agreements with all provinces except Ontario, and in these federal, provincial, territorial agreements, we don't have a proportional number of spaces in daycares for Francophones in minority settings. So you said earlier that you met with the Minister of Official Languages. Did you discuss this topic with her? I do not think I did. I'm not sure that we had identified that at that point. One thing is certain, in the future, we need to have inclusive clauses in these agreements. Mr. Commissioner, as you know, time is running out. You answered my question, so you met the minister. As far as you remember, you did not discuss this topic. Mr. Commissioner, I'd like to remind you that you told my colleague, Mrs. Kayabaya, that the next act needs to meet our needs of today, but especially for tomorrow. Here's a chronological reminder. In 2021, we tabled Bill C-32. Parliament suspended in July, and then we had an election. Then we formed cabinet in October. And then the cabinet gave itself 100 days before tabling a new updated act. Then, of course, the holidays came. So now it's February 2022. I asked you earlier if you thought we needed to adopt this bill quickly, and you have just asserted that when you met with the minister, you hadn't yet identified the issue with agreements with early childhood education centers. And you think we should adopt a bill quickly. So can you tell me what your definition is of the word quickly? Well, in a parliamentary context with the legislative process, quick can go from 18 to 24 months, leading up to royal assent. We need to have support of all parliamentarians. So when I say quick, I think it's important that the government table a bill and then the legislative process can start. It's difficult for me to say what quick is about the legislative process. It depends on the work of the committees.
With all due respect, sir, I'm not trying to trap you, but this is a very important act. Don't you think you'd like to have better tools in the future? Don't you think we should take the time to do things really well to set the foundations? Because right now, things aren't working. So we put forward Bill 32. You said it didn't have enough teeth. So I ask again, should we pass this bill quickly? I think we have to give things the time. We need a legislation that responds to the needs of today and of tomorrow. Now, I will leave it up to the minister and the government to decide on how fast this should be done. Now, as you know, until the bill is tabled, we haven't set the chronometer yet. The chronometer hasn't started. Well, we have some examples that we all know about doing things quickly. And if you do things too quickly, details are forgotten. And that was really what I wanted to say about the fact that sometimes when you try to get something through rapidly, it's not a good idea. This is a historic piece of legislation. Canada is a bilingual country, and we need the necessary tools. Thank you, Mr. Godin. I don't know if I'm the problem. Can you hear me? Our next speaker, Ms. Lattanzio.
Obviously, you know that I'm an Anglophone from Quebec, and I wanted to perhaps ask you the complaints that you've received. I understand there are about 1,000 per year. You mentioned 50,000 before, and I imagine that's over the lifespan of more than 10 years. But if we were to average it out, more or less about 1,000, and give me an idea, the nature and the quantities of complaints that you've received over the last course of 3-4 years from specifically Quebec, what would they be?
It would basically be with respect to receiving services in the language of your choice. And more often than not, that would be French. It would be, we have had a number of language of work complaints, but the vast majority have to do with receiving services from federal institutions in the language of their choice. And there's an array of institutions which are to use a lack of a better word, guilty of those behaviors. And it hasn't changed much over time. And for example, this year, we had a significant number of complaints with respect to the Air Canada CEO giving a unilingual speech, significant number from Quebec, but from across the country as well. Okay. So it's often with respect to communications in the language of one's choice.
Okay. And, before us, we have different groups that come to speak to us. And I'm sure you're very much familiar with QCGN. And they've presented to us their queries, their worries. And, one of the comments that comes back again and again and again is they're saying that the modernization of the official languages is doing really two things. It is, it's creating new language rights for only one language, and to the detriment of the other in Quebec. And secondly, it's saying that the proposed bill is not doing much to be able to fix the problems of Part 7 of the Act. And I just wanted to have your opinion on those two issues.
With respect to the first issue that you raised, you're referencing legislative asymmetry, which seems to be part of Bill C-32. The goal of C-32 is to achieve substantive equality. And I think those are two concepts that are quite different. Substantive equality is well defined by the Supreme Court in terms of how we can achieve substantive equality between linguistic communities. It doesn't mean we have to do the same thing for each community. Legislative asymmetry means that you bake into the legislation rights for one group and not for the other.
Exactly, and that seems to be the worry.
And I really understand the worry on behalf of the English-speaking communities of Quebec. And I do think, and if I'll make reference a previous speaker, if we're going to take more time to make sure that we table a piece of legislation, I think government has to rethink this whole question of asymmetry or in one way, how can we ensure that both linguistic communities are well represented and well defended in this new law?
Okay, and with regards to the issues of not fixing the issues with Part 7 of the Act,
I think
where have we missed the boat on that with regards to the projected law?
One of the problems in the law as it was written did not counter the Gascon decision. However, we've had a federal court decision in January, which basically countered the lower court decision. However, Part 7, we probably needs a regulation to talk about that the obligations for various institutions, for example, it's immigration, StatsCan, Canadian Heritage, those institutions that have a role to play in the development of official language in minority communities, we should specify these obligations within a regulation, deal with, for example, the concept of positive measures, and to define a number of these things. So right now, it might be the broad principles are there, but when it comes to the application, I think we have to look on the regulatory side.
So we need to be able to divvy up regulations.
Yes, I think we need to support Part 7. We need a regulatory framework.
And on what, what...
Madame Latanzio. We're at 5.
I'm sorry, Ms. Latanzio.
Theberge could send us his recommendations in terms of what he would see in the regulations by written essay. Thank
Absolument, les commentaires sont retenus.
Yes, I take note of your comments. Our colleague, Joël Godin, in his motion, mentions seeing the minister and her team for 2 hours. Now, to go past 5:30, I'll need unanimous consent. Now, for the next round, what I will do is that instead of 2 rounds for Conservatives and Liberals, there will be 5 minutes for each of them, and the Bloc and NDP will get 1.5 minutes each. That's what I suggest, because a full round would take at least 25 minutes. So option one, we cut everyone's time second. We can go forward, but we'll need a unanimous consent to continue after 5:30. The clerk has said everyone is ready for either option. Could you tell me, sir, what you think? Well, Mr. Speaker, after checking with our members, we can extend the time by 10 minutes. But before getting any further, we should perhaps see with the Commissioner if he and his team are available to stay here for 10 extra minutes. In order to be fair, because it's almost 5:30, or 5:20 rather. Can we give more time to the New Democrats? Well, we're trying to respect proportionality. This is why I said there'd be a Liberal question, a Conservative question, we could all the time could be cut by 5, or else we can take 25 minutes. Mr. Chairman, what I suggest is that we say 125 for the Bloc and New Democrats as a favor. So, and then we in the Conservative Party, we would give up our last 5 minutes. And the Liberals can decide what they want to do with their 5 minutes. Well, as I've been speaking with you, the clerk says we have plenty of time to have a full round of questions. Yes, I'd like to suggest something. Sorry? Who has the floor, Mr. Chairman? Go ahead, Mr. Godin. What I propose is that we extend by 10 minutes so that the 4 next questions be as provided for, because I can't stay more than 10 minutes past the time that was provided for. So do we have unanimous consent? Are there any objections? I see no raised hands. Mr. Beaulieu, is that all right with you? All right. Great. It's unanimous, and we'll now go forward with the next round of questions. In order, 4 questions, and we'll start this last round, 5 minutes, with Mr. Jacques Gourde. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Theberge, you talked about the foundations for the next version of the Official Languages Act. I'd like you to explain what these foundations are and how we can make them solid, that will last and serve for the next 40 years. Well, I haven't talked about governance with respect to the Official Languages Act. In the bill, we see that they propose shared governance between Treasury Board and Canadian Heritage. I think it extremely important that some central agency be empowered to coordinate and ensure the governance at the federal level to make sure that other departments also respect their obligations. There will be a shared jurisdiction among departments. The Department of Canadian Heritage will be responsible for some issues under Part 7, immigration for immigrants. I think we need a central agency in order to issue directives, policies, etc. Now, talking to stakeholders, they often raised the governance issue. Also, the issue of the language clauses, the issue of conformity, and immigration was also often raised. If we want to reach substantive equality, this is the way we have to go. Because this is Part 7 of the Act. We've talked a lot about it. And I can get information to whoever wants it on Part 7. It's crucial to the development of communities. When we look at the Act, there is the federal government, which communicates with Canadians and provides services. But Part 7 has to do with communities. That's the other part. If we want to abide by the concept of linguistic duality, we need something that is robust, solid, in order that institutional bilingualism be implemented so that Canadians can receive services and communications in the language of their choice in ordinary time, but also during an emergency. I think we have to revisit the legislation and make sure that it meets the needs of Canadians, not only today, but tomorrow. We need a technologically neutral piece of legislation. And I'll stop there. It seems that you were really inspired. Now, with respect to Treasury Board, it has more power and more credibility such that it could be one of the institutions in the next version of the Act. Well, it has the tools necessary to deal with coordination. And there would also be a pan-governmental approach, an all-of-government approach to ensure community development and to coordinate the plan and its delivery. They could also implement a consultative mechanism, and they could also make sure that the various policies and other things respect the needs of communities. Thank you, Mr. Gould. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. The next question will be shared by Ms. Kayabaga and her colleague. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to get back to the question I was asking earlier about the Fédération des Francophones and the Federal Court of Appeal. You said that the reparations ruled on by the court would ensure neutrality with respect to language minorities. Now, do you have anything to say about COVID-19? Well, first question. When you talk about the federal court's ruling, we got complaints in 2018 about Part 7, and it was clear that some federal institutions had violated the legislation. In his ruling, Judge Gascon said the complaints were not founded. Now, we can investigate thoroughly any complaints with respect to Part 7. And to get to your second question, quickly, could you repeat? Yes, about COVID-19. Thank you. I had a memory blank. With respect to COVID-19, we had to intervene in March, as early as March and April, intervene with federal institutions to make sure that communications about COVID were in both official languages, because for a while, Health Canada had allowed unilingual labeling. But we had to make sure that people could switch from one language to the other. The pandemic showed the weaknesses, the chinks in the armor of federal institutions in responding in both official languages. I think, we have to learn the lessons of the pandemic and consider how we will deal with further emergencies so that we'll be ready before and not after the event.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So you receive complaints, as you said, What is the percentage of complaints coming from new immigrants? And what is the most recurring topic among the complaints you receive? I cannot really answer that question. Like the number of complaints coming from new immigrants, I'm not even sure we collect such data. But here is what I can do. I don't have the information, but we'll see what we can do. And what is the most recurring topic regarding the complaints you receive? Lack of services in the preferred language, maybe from Air Canada. Travelers include aerial transportation, airport security, border services, people who work in those areas seem to not have many services offered in both languages. So you're saying that it's the travel sector that seem to be the subject of complaints. Yeah. And like I said earlier, some agencies are third parties and they are subject to the Official Languages Act, but I believe there's not enough supervision with regard to these agencies. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner, Mr. Iacono, and Ms. Kayabaga. Next question from Mr. Beaulieu for 2.5 minutes. Mr. Teberge, a long time ago, you said that we need the right conditions so that Francophones can work with the French language. What are those conditions? Could we think about French language units inside the federal government? I believe there are several solutions. I think the first solution is the following. Some cultural elements need to change. Too often, English is the language of work and French is the language that is translated. So we have to change this type of behavior first. And what can we do? We have to make sure that the leadership in place has the necessary skills. Senior officials, deputy ministers do not necessarily have to be bilingual, but we do need the leadership to lead by example. Otherwise, how can we have the necessary structures? So you're saying that leaders have to be bilingual. So I just want to give you an example briefly. 5 Anglophone technicians work at Radio-Canada for a Francophone show. Can they require the director of the show to talk to them in English only? So you see, at some point, a shared language has to be there, especially for Francophones in minority settings. It's very hard to speak French when everybody else is speaking English. So, you know, in settings where Francophones are more numerous compared to their Anglophone counterparts, then yeah, they need to be able to speak French. What do you think? I think it's an approach, among others. To me, we always have to lead by example. That's a way to bring about changes. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Sorry, Mr. Beaulieu. Last round, Ms. Ashton, 2.5 minutes. The floor is yours. Thank you. Mr. Commissioner, I'd like to go back to the the learning of French as a second language, it is still a big challenge. For me, for instance, we've been waiting for over a year so that my children can have spots in a francophone childcare. The childcare does not have enough staff because of COVID. And IRCC did not manage to hire enough people so that there would be enough staff members. So the shortage of staff is not only in francophone childcare and schools, but everywhere else. What does it mean when you don't have enough support, funding, and staff related to immigration? What does that mean when it comes to learning a foreign language? What does it mean to be bilingual? How to support bilingualism in a country like Canada? A quick response. There is a huge shortage of bilingual staff for francophone schools, immersion schools, and childcare. In the last budget, they try to fill the gaps when it comes to schools where you can learn French as a second language. Now, for childcare, we need people with specific skills. We might need to recruit people from abroad. Thank you very much, Mr. Commissioner, Ms. Ashton. Thank you very much, Mr. Commissioner, for your presentation. I see that you didn't come alone. Ms. Gervais, Mr. Leduc, Mr. Trepanier, Ms. Giguère. If you think you were not able to answer fully all the questions, please feel free to send the clerk any additional information that could complete your answers. Thank you very much. Thank you to the analysts, clerks, technicians, interpreters. Thank you all. Do I have an agreement to adjourn this meeting? Marilyn?
I propose.
Merci, Madame la journée. Merci tout le monde. Bonne soirée.
Merci.